This is Prague, a city built upon the crushing, ancient, and almost suffocating weight of history, where every single cobbled street, every shadowed and damp alleyway, and every Gothic bridge arching over the Vltava seems to resonate with the heavy, rhythmic echo of centuries-old secrets kept under lock and key. It is a metropolis defined by a perennial mist and a thick, almost tangible mystery, a place where the modern science of millimetric precision clashes violently and silently with an ancient, forgotten magic that still pulses beneath the pavement. Here, the very idea of free will is not a human right, but appears to be merely a cold, calculated gear in a much larger, darker, and more intricate plan. At the absolute beating heart of the old town square lies the Orloj, the legendary astronomical clock, a masterpiece of medieval astronomy, art, and complex, terrifying mechanics. But what if this clock was not just a timekeeper, a mere ornament for tourists to photograph while eating their local pastries? What if it were a functional, high-frequency device, a silent weapon of massive social engineering? What if it were actively modulating, harvesting, and manipulating the most volatile and powerful force of humanity, the destiny of love and human relationships? The astronomical clock would not just be counting the hours, but surgically programming the success or failure of every single soul walking beneath its long shadow, defining who should love, who should marry, and who should eventually hate, all to maintain the rigid, sterile balance of an invisible, timeless elite. Jakub Horace was known in the most obscure and clandestine circles of Central Europe simply as a clockmaker. However, his hands did not deal with simple brass gears, common steel springs, or the delicate balance wheels of pocket watches. He was, in truth, a master chronologist of human events, an expert in nonlinear temporal patterns who sold destiny forecasts to the highest bidders, the powerful and the truly desperate Prague. Jakub had spent decades of his life studying what he called the dance of coincidences, a phenomenon that most people dismissed as mere luck or divine providence. But through obsessive statistical analysis, quantum monitoring, and hours of observation from the high, dusty windows of his attic, he discovered a horrifying truth. The fate of lovers in this city was not a random chaos of feelings or a biological spark. On the contrary, love in Prague moved in strangely predictable, haunting, and synchronized cycles. Waves of sudden, passionate, and life-changing union were always followed, with a frightening mathematical regularity, by brutal disintegrations, sudden betrayals, and traumatic public divorces. Every major wedding of the modern Czech aristocracy, every love scandal that hit the tabloids, and every devastating, quiet separation could be mapped with absolute, terrifying precision back to a single geographical point, the Orloj. Jakub proved, to his own growing and paralyzing horror, that the clock did not just predict the future. It actively engineered it through invisible, low-frequency pulses of emotional modulation. The anomaly that Jakub tracked during endless, caffeine-fueled, sleepless nights was an intense and constant bond frequency emission emanating directly from the deep, lead-lined bowels of the Orloj's ancient tower. This frequency was not electrical or magnetic in any traditional scientific sense. It was a temporal vibration, a ripple in the fabric of the present, pulsing with the concentrated force of the collective emotion of millions of people who, over the long centuries, had looked up at the clock seeking hope, solace, or some form of divine intervention. Popular legend, whispered in the taverns of the Mala Strana, said that if you stood under the Orloj at the exact strike of 12, your love would be granted eternity. Jakub discovered that the reality was a dark, cynical, and mechanical opposite of this legend. The clock was, in fact, a destiny frequency stabilizer. It functioned like a gigantic metaphysical sponge, a vacuum for human spirit, absorbing the raw energy of all the encounters, first kisses, and marriages in the city. It processes vital, chaotic force through its ancient, cursed gears and released it back into the atmosphere in controlled, limited, and sanitized patterns. The ultimate goal of this grand mechanism was not to foster happiness, but to restrict the amplitude of human passion. The elite who controlled the clock knew that true, unbridled love was the only thing capable of breaking their chains. So they ensured that no emotional bond in Prague ever became so intense that it could threaten the established social order or the absolute, silent control they held over the city's pulse. Jakob observed, in painstaking and agonizing detail, that the Orloj frequency operated on a cold, merciless principle of amplitude correction. Whenever a relationship in Prague reached what the machine considered a dangerous peak of intensity, a rare state of absolute love, unrestrained devotion, and total unshakable loyalty, the clock sensors detected this happiness anomaly as a direct threat to stability of its system. It would then, with the precision of a surgeon, release a subtle yet profoundly destructive temporal pulse. This pulse did not strike like lightning. It acted directly on the subconscious minds of the lovers involved. It would introduce, at the perfect psychological moment of vulnerability, an irrational doubt, an unfounded jealousy, a sudden memory of a past hurt, or would attract external discords, a lost job, a sudden illness, a tempting stranger that seemed like mere coincidences of life. The Orloj was therefore a sophisticated emotional castration machine on an urban scale, brilliantly and cruelly disguised as a cultural monument and a symbol of national pride. No one was truly free to love in the shadows of Prague's spires. Everyone was merely a character in mechanical, pre-written script, their deepest feelings trimmed like the rough edges of a factory part, so they would fit perfectly and obediently into the cold, unyielding machine of the state. This systematic interference was designed to prevent the emergence of powerful, united bloodlines or revolutionary alliances born of genuine passion. Jakob's relentless and increasingly dangerous search for truth led him to discover the original, uncensored plans of the Orloj. He found them hidden in a lead-lined, forgotten vault beneath the library of the Straha Monastery, a place where the air was still and smelled of ancient parchment and the sweat of dead monks. These documents, written in a mix of Latin, Hebrew, and a forgotten alchemical cipher, revealed that the clock was not just the work of Mikulas of Katan and Jan Sindel as history claimed. It was a grand, multi-generational project of a secret consortium of 15th century astronomers, mathematicians, and dark alchemists known only as the Order of Exact Time. These men fervently and fanatically believed that uncontrolled human love was the only force in the universe capable of generating temporal chaos and destabilizing the divine right of kings and the structures of power. For them, passion was not a virtue. It was a dangerous, volatile form of radiation that needed to be contained, filtered, and recycled. They built the Orloj as a metaphysical dam for this energy. The internal mechanisms, disguised as complex astrological dials, lunar phases, and animated figures that enchanted the passing tourists, were actually powerful condensers and amplifiers of emotional energy, tuned to the exact, resonant frequency of the human heart in its most vulnerable state. Jakob's plot thickened and quickly became a frantic race for survival when he crossed paths with Dr. Eliska Valkova. Eliska was a brilliant, sharp-tongued sociologist who had been unceremoniously expelled from Charles University after publishing a controversial study on the impossible statistics of synchronized divorces in the Prague metropolitan area. Eliska had noticed, through advanced big data analysis and social mapping, that breakups in the city were geometrically and chronologically perfect. They were not chaotic, messy, or purely emotional as they were in other major world capitals. Instead, they followed a predictable, terrifying regression line, as if an invisible mechanical force were determining the expiration date of each relationship to prevent any single couple from accumulating too much social influence, financial stability, or emotional power. When Jakob found her, she was being pursued by silent, gray-suited government agents in a rain-slicked alleyway near the Jewish quarter. Together, in the flickering light of a safe house, they realized that their fields of study were the two halves of the same dark coin. Jakob had the how, the mechanical and temporal method of manipulation, and Eliska had the what, the statistical human proof of profound damage caused to the population of Prague over 6 centuries of engineer heartbreak. Using a prototype temporal scanner that Jakub had painstakingly built himself from scavenged laboratory parts and ancient clock components, they began to superimpose his Orloj emission data with Aliska's sociological charts. The correlation they saw on the screen was startling, undeniable, and bone-chilling. Every single peak of collective happiness, every moment of social unity or revolutionary fervor in Prague's history, was followed within hours by a discord wave pulse emanating from the clock's tower. They discovered that the order of exact time was not a relic of the past. It still existed, operating with modern efficiency behind the scenes of the municipal administration, the high church, and the national museums. Their goal remained unchanged: to transform Prague into a perfect, static, and predictable museum city, a place where nothing new, nothing revolutionary, and nothing truly unpredictable could ever happen. It was to be a city where love was just a controlled accessory, a manageable hobby, and where the future was a pre-installed iron track from which no one could deviate. The Orloj was the beating, mechanical heart of the system, and the current chief curator of Prague, a man of cold intellect named Orloj Novak, was the one who now held his hand on the lever of human destiny. The critical, breaking moment for their mission arrived when the Orloj sensors identified what the Order called a rupture couple, Adam and Teresa. They were young, vibrant street artists, a painter and a musician, whose destinies were so naturally and deeply intertwined that their emotional synergy was beginning to create a massive interference vacuum in the Orloj containment field. Their love was so authentic, so raw, and so resilient against the subtle, daily pulses of doubt that the clock simply could no longer process or contain them. They were a virus in the system of order. If Adam and Teresa's bond was allowed to solidify into a permanent union, the Orloj frequency would enter a state of catastrophic resonance, a feedback loop that could potentially shut down temporal and emotional control over the entire Czech region. Orloj Novak, acting on behalf of the Order, decided the couple needed to be destroyed. But he would not use physical violence, which would only create martyrs and more emotional energy. Instead, he chose the total, silent annihilation of their shared past. He activated the final destiny sequence, a secret, high-level protocol that used the clock's power to reach back and rewrite the lovers' very memories. It would make them believe they had never truly loved each other, turning years of shared affection, struggle, and joy into bitter, false memories of contempt, hidden debts, and unforgivable betrayals. Jakub and Aliska, monitoring the system from their hideout, knew they had only a few precious hours before the clock struck midnight, and the memory rewrite became permanent and irreversible. They needed to invade the Orloj Tower immediately, but the main access was now surrounded by elite, silent guards who didn't even seem to breathe. The only way in was through a forgotten, partially flooded tunnel that connected the old underground town hall torture chambers, horrific relics of the 15th century, directly to the clock's gear room. As they descended into the cold, damp, and suffocating depths of Prague's underbelly, the very air began to vibrate with a high-pitched hum of static electricity. They felt the crushing, phantom weight of thousands of interrupted destinies, of unfulfilled lives and stolen dreams, pressing against their temples. Jakub whispered to Aliska, his voice trembling, that the Orloj did not just emit frequencies. It was a massive storage device for stolen time. It held the years of happiness and potential that the people of Prague should have lived, but were confiscated by the machine to power its own unnatural existence. The tower was not just a clock. It was a colossal, humming battery of unlived life, a monument to human potential that had been harvested like wheat. Upon finally reaching the chronological heart, the sight that met them was both hypnotic and terrifyingly alien. Gigantic gears, some as tall as houses, made of a strange, iridescent metal that seemed to glow with its own internal, sickly light, turned in absolute, eerie silence, defying every known law of friction and physics. In the center of this mechanical forest, Orloj Novak sat calmly before a console of translucent, pulsating crystal. He was watching Adam and Teresa's destiny lines on a holographic display. They were glowing brightly, but were beginning to fray, snap, and turn a dull gray under the immense pressure of the machine's rewrite. Novak was not surprised by their intrusion. As a man of absolute, fanatical order, he believed that even Jakub's rebellion was a statistical probability, a minor deviation that had already been accounted for in the grander plan. He defended his actions with a chilling academic calm that was more terrifying than rage. He stated that without the Orloj stabilizing and dampening influence, Prague would long ago have plunged into a civil war of irrational passions, religious zealotry, and destructive egos. He truly believed that the systematic sacrifice of individual happiness was a small, necessary, and even noble price to pay for the immortality of the city as a monument of perfect, unchanging Gothic order. Eliska, her eyes burning with a mix of fury and tears, argued with a voice full of human fire. She told him that a city without unpredictable, messy, and even painful love was not a city at all, but just a luxury graveyard, a beautiful, gilded cage for the living dead. While Novak tried to intellectually seduce them with his talk of the greater good and social harmony, Jakub began secretly operating the secondary maintenance terminal he had hacked into. He realized with a heavy heart that he couldn't simply turn off the clock or blow it up. If he did, the sudden, violent, and unshielded release of 600 years of contained, compressed, and frustrated emotional energy would cause an immediate collective psychotic outbreak. It would be a wave of madness that would destroy every mind in the city in a single second. He needed a more elegant, more scientific, and more chaotic solution: synchronized chaos. He connected his modified handheld device to the chronological heart and began injecting billions of fragments of raw, random, and unfilterable data, unwritten poems, improvised street songs, the whispers of forgotten lovers, the nonsensical laughter of the insane, and the vivid, chaotic dreams of children. He was flooding the cold, logical control algorithm with the pure, unmanageable essence of human unpredictability. The clock began to vibrate, groan, and shriek in a way it never had since the day it was first consecrated by the blood of its creators. The wooden figures of the 12 apostles began to move frantically out of their century-old sequence, their mechanical eyes appearing to roll in their sockets. The sound of the gears, once a terrifying silence, became a deafening, overwhelming roar of overlapping human voices, 1,000 years of suppressed laughter, hidden crying, and whispered promises. Karel Novak finally lost his composure, panicking as he saw that the Wheel of Fortune, the master anchor of the entire destiny system, began to spin in opposite directions at the same time, its logic failing and its crystal housing beginning to crack. The cold, precise geometry of the order of exact time was being drowned, atom by atom, by the warm, chaotic, and uncontrollable sea of unpredictability that Jakub had released from his small device. At the height of this mechanical and spiritual struggle, a blinding flash of brilliant sapphire light filled the entire tower, and a pulse of pure, raw energy swept through the old town square like a physical wind. It was not a pulse of destruction, but of restoration, a total temporal reset of the heart. In that magnificent and terrifying instant, every single person in the city of Prague felt, for a brief, transcendent second, the heavy, wonderful weight of their own choices returning to their own hands. The mechanical control was shattered. The Orloj stopped emitting the stabilization frequency and became, for the first time in its long and bloody history, just a clock, a beautiful, intricate machine, but no longer a master of souls. Adam and Teresa, standing on the Charles Bridge under the stone gaze of saints and kings, who were about to separate forever over a futile, engineered argument about a forgotten slight, suddenly stopped and looked at each other with profound, renewed clarity. They realized with a shock that the hatred, the bitterness, and the sudden coldness they felt only moments ago was not theirs. It was an intrusion, a foreign object in their hearts. Jakub and Eliska managed to escape into the labyrinth of Prague's night before the state authorities or the Order's enforcers could regain control of the tower. They took with them the Prague dossier, a massive collection of physical and digital evidence that exposed 6 centuries of systematic temporal manipulation. However, They knew the truth was too dangerous, too destabilizing to be released to the public all at once. A society raised in a cage, whose very marriages were dictated by a clock, does not always know how to breathe the thin, intoxicating air of total freedom. Curator Novak disappeared into the deep, ancient shadows of the city, likely to report his catastrophic failure to even more powerful, unseen superiors in other major world capitals, London, Rome, perhaps even Washington. Jakub and Aliska became the clandestine guardians of chance, the watchers in the dark. They established a secret network, a shadow archive of human randomness, to monitor other suspected control clocks and destiny monuments around the globe. Prague, in turn, was slowly, painfully, and beautifully reborn. The city became less perfect, noisier, more chaotic, and certainly more dangerous, but it was infinitely more alive. Marriages were no longer statistically guaranteed to fail or succeed at the whim of a gear, and divorces became messy, emotional, and authentically human again. Love in the Golden City regained its dangerous, terrifying, and beautiful unpredictability. Jakub often sits now in a small, nameless cafe in the square, his old eyes watching the tourists take photos of the Orloj, smiling as he hears the clock strike the hours, knowing that the animated figures are now just wooden dolls performing a play, no longer the silent executors of a pre-written cold destiny. To further understand the magnitude of the Order's influence, one must delve into the architectural layout of Prague itself. Eliska's research suggested that the city was not merely a collection of buildings, but a precisely tuned resonator. The spires of the Tin Church, the heavy stones of the Powder Tower, and the alignment of the Charles Bridge were all designed to focus psychic energy toward the square. Every festival, every execution, and every historical upheaval was orchestrated to feed the machine. The Order didn't just control the present. They were farmers of historical momentum. They understood that to control a people, you must control their perception of time. If you can make a population believe that their future is inevitable, they will stop trying to change it. This was the true genius of the Orloj. It was a weapon of psychological surrender, convincing millions that their heartbreaks and their triumphs were written in the stars, when in fact, they were written in the teeth of a gear. The aftermath of the Sapphire Reset brought about strange phenomena. For weeks, people reported temporal echoes, memories of lives they had never lived, or perhaps lives they would have lived if the machine hadn't intervened. Some found themselves suddenly skilled in trades they had never studied, while others felt a profound, inexplicable grief for partners they had never met. These were the fragments of the stolen time, returning to the collective consciousness. It was a period of intense spiritual upheaval. The Order attempted to suppress these reports, calling them a mass hallucination caused by a rare atmospheric event over the Vltava River. But the seeds of doubt had been sown. The people were starting to remember what it felt like to be the masters of their own seconds. Jakub and Aliska knew that their victory in Prague was only a local one. The Order was global, and its roots were deep. They discovered that the Orloj in Prague was connected to a similar device in Venice, hidden within the clock tower of St. Mark's Square, and another in the shadows of London's Big Ben. These devices formed a network, a temporal grid, that covered the civilized world. Each clock managed a different aspect of human existence, one for ambition, one for creativity, one for fear. Prague's specialty had always been the heart. The clockmaker and the sociologist spent their nights decoding the encrypted transmissions they intercepted from the tower's residual signal, mapping out the nodes of this invisible empire. They were no longer just observers. They were the first soldiers in a war for the liberation of the human timeline. As the years passed, the legend of the clockmaker of chaos grew in the underworld of Prague. Whispers told of a man who could see the threads of fate and a woman who could predict the movements of the invisible masters. They became ghosts in the system, moving through the city's underground tunnels, always one step ahead of Karel Novak's successors. They were building resistance to the random, recruiting others who had been woken by the reset, disgraced scientists, disillusioned priests, and artists who refused to paint within the lines. Their mission was to find a master clock, the primary emitter that synchronized the entire grid, a device rumored to be buried beneath the sands of Egypt, far older and more powerful than anything built in the Middle Ages. The reality you live in right now is merely the winning timeline, the one that survived the filters and the dampeners of the order. But the echoes of other versions of you, the ones who love without restriction, the ones who chose the path of most resistance, still whisper in the corners of cities like Prague. If you felt the pull of this chronicle, if you realize your own life might have patterns and coincidences that you didn't choose, do not let the mystery end here. The control of human destiny is not limited to ancient astronomical clocks. It extends to the very buildings you enter, the streets you walk, the algorithms that suggest your music, and the statues you admire without a second thought. Every coincidence is a clue. Every irrational feeling is a signal from the part of you that refuses to be programmed. Aliska's final entry in the Prague dossier contained a warning. The machine is not just outside of us. It is inside. We have been taught to fear the unknown, to crave the security of a predictable life. But predictability is the death of the soul. The only way to stay free is to stay unpredictable. This became the mantra of the Shadow Archive. They realized that the Order's greatest weapon was not the gears or the frequencies, but the human desire for certainty. By embracing the chaos of genuine emotion, they were fighting the machine at its most fundamental level. They were teaching the world how to be human again, in all its messy, glorious, and unpredictable splendor. Jakob often reflected on the nature of time as he watched the sunrise over the Bohemian hills. Time wasn't a river, and it wasn't a circle. It was a field of infinite possibilities, most of which were being actively suppressed by those who feared the power of a truly free humanity. He looked at his hands, once callous from repairing pocket watches, now steady from the weight of his new responsibility. He knew that the struggle would outlive him, but he also knew that the Sapphire Reset had proven one thing. The gears of the masters are strong, but they are no match for the true resonance of a free heart. The clock was still ticking, but for the first time in 6 centuries, it wasn't a countdown to a pre-written end. It was a heartbeat. The story of the Prague Astronomical Clock is a reminder that the most beautiful facades often hide the most sinister functions. It teaches us to question the things we take for granted, to look for the mechanisms behind the magic. It reminds us that our stories are our own to write, and that no matter how powerful a machine may seem, it is built on a foundation of stolen potential, and that potential can always be reclaimed. As long as there are those who are willing to descend into the tunnels, to face the curators of our lives, and to inject a little chaos into the system, there is hope for the human timeline. The mist over Prague may be thick, but it cannot hide the truth forever. To access the full, unedited Prague Chronicler's dossier, containing the exact locations of other tempered devices, the decrypted alchemical formulas for frequency modulation, and the deep, dark history of the Order of Exact Time, you must continue to look beyond the surface of what you call history. The next secret in our journey will take us far from the mist and the cobblestones of Central Europe, to the scorching, eternal, and unforgiving sands of a land where time itself was buried under millions of tons of stone in absolute, divine silence. The manipulation is not just about the fate of lovers or the timing of a divorce, but about the very essence of human mortality, the theft of the afterlife, and the engineering of eternal life for a select few. Our next chronicle will reveal the forbidden truth about the cradle of civilization and the silent watcher in the desert. The alchemist exposed the truth about Cairo, the sphinx that controls immortality. The chronicles have already begun their countdown, and each chapter unearths another layer of the invisible, magnificent prison we have called home for far too long. Discover the secrets hidden in London, New Orleans, Paris, Rome, Venice, Tokyo, New York, Berlin, Istanbul, Rio de Janeiro, and Sydney in our exclusive playlist. The world is waiting to be truly discovered, not just observed, And for the first time in 600 years, the clock is finally ticking for us, and for us alone,